Hey guys, Mr. Happy here and welcome to Final Fantasy Bestiary. This series is dedicated to discovering the history and lore of Final Fantasy's most iconic creatures and characters. This episode, we look at the daring duo Biggs and Wedge. Keep in mind, we will be discussing multiple game titles and story involvements here, so there may be some spoilers. You have been warned. Biggs and Wedge basically count as a single entity for the sake of this series, but also in Final Fantasy as a whole. You'll never find one of them without the other, as is to be expected. They are a pair of characters that are thrown into Final Fantasy games pretty much every chance Square or Square Enix gets. The pair themselves are actually inspired from Star Wars. I didn't actually know that prior to making this video. That's right, remember those two Red Squadron wingmen from episode 4 of Star Wars? I never even thought twice about it, but in case you don't, their names are Biggs Darklighter and Wedge Antilles. Don't know how I ever forgot that one. And yes, they were the two pilots alongside Luke in the trench. While Wedge survived the encounter, Biggs did not, but let's get away from the Star Wars talk because, well, this isn't a Star Wars Bestiary series. Normally, this is about the time I tell you, oh, this is what they look like, and their personalities, and their abilities, and some common traits. The thing is, Biggs and Wedge aren't so two-dimensional in their purpose, no pun intended for the earlier Final Fantasy titles. They have been adapted in so many different ways that I think it's best we just speak on their Final Fantasy appearances individually. It turns out, Biggs and Wedge's first appearance was actually in Final Fantasy IV. I know a lot of you were thinking a different title, but there's a good reason. They weren't named in Final Fantasy IV. Two of the Red Wing soldiers that questioned Cecil about the order to raid Mysidia, they're actually Biggs and Wedge, though it's not actually revealed until the After Years, which came out many years later. I guess it's no surprise that they were part of the Red Wings though, was it? However, most people remember them from the first part of Final Fantasy VI, where Biggs and Wedge were the two other soldiers that traveled with Terra Branford at the start of the game. While they are killed shortly after, they still remain memorable for their short appearance. Perhaps it's because players were expecting to use these characters for the rest of the game, only to have them killed off so quickly. Fun fact, Biggs somehow got mistranslated over in America as Vix, and it's actually made fun of in quite a few other titles, but the most notable one was in Dissidia, where Biggs states in his Final Fantasy VI sprite, "There is no Vix, only Biggs." This in itself is actually a reference to Ghostbusters, the line, "There is no Dana, only Zool." Sorry, had to get that in there as well. The daring duo would continue to appear in subsequent titles afterwards. In Final Fantasy VII, they are accompanied by a third person, Jessie, as part of Avalanche at the start of the game. They do their best to take on Shinra until Shinra decides to attack the plate above Sector 7. They are wounded in the battle prior, along with Jessie, and eventually killed when the plate falls and crushes the entire sector. There are also two machines named after them in Crisis Core, though they are completely unrelated to their Final Fantasy VII counterparts. And in Dirge of Cerberus, at some point, I believe you do meet a girl who says that her brother was killed when the plate fell 3 years ago, hinting could have been Biggs or Wedge. Final Fantasy VIII saw them returning as villains and one of the earlier boss fights in the game. Since Final Fantasy VIII was actually my first Final Fantasy, this was my first time meeting the duo. Major Biggs and Lieutenant Wedge were members of the Galbadia army working to repair the Dale radio tower. They are fought briefly before the true boss in the encounter, Elvorit, blows them away. They are seen later in Disc 2 in the D District prison where they recognize the party who got them demoted. They appear one last time in the Lunatic Pandora where they consider leaving the Galbadia army. So, unlike in the previous two titles, they actually end up living. If you don't count Final Fantasy IV where they weren't even named, this makes the first time they've survived an entire Final Fantasy title. Biggs and Wedge skipped Final Fantasy IX despite me personally thinking they could have filled two roles very early in the game very easily. They do appear in Final Fantasy X as guards for the Blitzball Stadium in Lucca. Should the player desire to become involved with the Blitzball minigame, they can also be recruited and have some very high stat. They are considered upper tier characters. They naturally become part of the Gullwings Blitzball team in Final Fantasy X too, though that minigame wasn't nearly as fun as it was in Final Fantasy X. Another game Biggs and Wedge weren't present in, surprisingly, is Final Fantasy XI, which Square Enix themselves has said is their most profitable Final Fantasy game to date. Some have said these absences in these certain Final Fantasy games, such as 9 and 11, are due to a difference in development teams in the company, where games with Biggs and Wedge in them are usually directed and produced by Yoshinori Kitase, I'm sure I butchered that, and games without them are usually not. A look at his works within the company, actually incredibly consistent with this thought. Though now that Biggs and Wedge are so popular, you do see them in other games that Kitase himself is not involved with, and we'll be going over some of those. And that includes actually some of the remakes, including Final Fantasy 1 and Final Fantasy 4, the after years. Regardless, they were in the next Kitase game, Final Fantasy 12, though not quite in the same way. Technically, Biggs and Wedge are nowhere to be found in this game. Instead, we are greeted by Gibbs and DeWeg. Gibbs is basically Biggs with the B and the G's switched. So instead of one B and two G's, it's one G and two B's. And DeWeg is actually wedged backwards, sort of. I think it's more of Pig Latin because I don't know. You start at the D in the middle of Wedge and you go backwards to DEW, and then you start at the end of his name and it's EG, so that spells DeWeg. I don't know. I'm sure there's a word for that, but I'm literature, whatever. The point is, they're two Arcadian soldiers, and they only appear very briefly in the game. In Final Fantasy 13, Biggs and Wedge don't ever make a physical appearance. Sad, sad day. However, there is instead a player store that can be accessed called B&W Outfitters, which most certainly stands for Biggs and Wedge. They do eventually have a physical appearance, however, in Lightning Returns, as the two friends are running secret tours in Yusnan. They do eventually open up an event called Death Game, where they turn the extremely deadly warehouses into a game of life and death. Challengers are tasked with killing 30 enemies within the chaos, or die trying. Lightning eventually overcomes the challenge and demands that it be shut down to prevent people from throwing their lives away. And finally, we make it to Final Fantasy XIV, where Biggs and Wedge hold a major role in the main story missions. They are engineers under Sid Garland and part of his Garland Ironworks. They help the player along their journey in defeating the Garland Empire and eventually assist them in unlocking the door to the Crystal Tower. Biggs is a Rogadin and Wedge is a Lalafell. Now, while that's it for the numbered series, Biggs and Wedge continue their cameos across other Square Enix titles, though not as frequently as some of their other, I guess, recurring characters. They do appear in Tactics and Tactics Advance, though not in the traditional sense, as well as in Final Fantasy Dimensions. However, most people know them for the ever-popular Chrono Trigger, where they were present alongside a third soldier, Piet, in the Tent of Horrors. Funny, Piet is actually another Star Wars reference to Admiral Firmus Piet in episodes 5 and 6 of the Star Wars trilogy. The original one, that is, the good one. They are also briefly present with Jesse and Barrett in Kingdom Hearts 2, where they appear as shopkeepers. Biggs also does host the Struggle Tournament, which you are introduced to very early in the game. Now, Biggs and Wedge are basically mandatory at this point in a Final Fantasy title. Every time a new one comes out, people keep their eyes open for any sort of indication of these two that they will make some sort of appearance. Fortunately for us, this is something Square Enix does very well, placing things we recognize from prior Final Fantasies into future ones. Heck, that's what this entire series is based off of, and it at least fuels our nostalgia every time we play a new Final Fantasy game. Looking forward to seeing Biggs and Wedge on the PlayStation 4 and Final Fantasy 15. They better be there. Square Enix, make it happen. But anyway, guys, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, please like, favorite, subscribe, and share for more Final Fantasy videos. Of course, you can check out the rest of my channel where I do have other Final Fantasy game videos. 13, Lightning Returns, I meant to say. Final Fantasy 11, Final Fantasy 14 guides, if you're into that. Check out those videos, and we're going to be doing a lot over the course of this next year. And of course, be sure to follow me on Facebook and Twitter where you can get regular updates about when I'm posting videos, what I'm doing, what I'm thinking. You can pick my brain a little bit. And of course, you can follow me on Twitch where I do live stream basically whatever I want. Final Fantasy 14 every Mondays, but currently trying to stream as much Final Fantasy in the month of February because, you know, FFF, just a cool thing to say, F to the third. But anyway, guys, thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.